Have no PowerPoint on the last panel. We have gone naked. We also have a short last panel, so two virtues we have. And this panel is supposed to be to gather up takeaways for policy and research. We have apparently some designated note takers so that all of the pearls of wisdom that you and the panel are going to impart will be taken down and immortalized in some fashion, hopefully in the near future. So be careful what you say. But we might not attribute it to you, so that's okay. We'll just attribute it to the discussion. So you can say what you think really needs to be said. In this session today, we've had a lot of discussion on Sigma implementation in the San Joaquin Valley. You've seen a lot of discussion of state and local policies and strategies for implementing Sigma and managing groundwater, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley. And you've seen a lot of some of the research that goes on in this area, both in the University of California system as well as with PPIC, and how these groups actually are getting along, which I think is, if you can get a bunch of academics to get along, it's not impossible to implement Sigma. I mean, I got to tell you, I've been to enough faculty meetings, and several of you have been to, so there is hope. If we can manage the research on groundwater collaboratively, then I think it can be done statewide, although not without difficulty or expense. So today we have a nice panel to help us finish off here, and then hopefully we'll collect some thoughts from you all as well. We've got Daniel Kozad from the Central Valley Salinities Alternative and Long-Term Sustainability. We've got Debbie Franco from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, who does a lot of work related to groundwater. Michael Koparski from the Wheeler Institute at the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment at Berkeley Law School. And we have, as a late addition, well, actually a substitute for David Puglia, Paul Hendricks from the Tulare Irrigation District. So this, I think, is a wide-ranging panel, and we're going to lead off going down this order of folks giving 2 to 4 minutes of what they think are the main takeaways we should be concentrating on. So I look forward to it.
It was 5 minutes earlier.
5 minutes.
Shrinking, okay. I guess I have to talk fast. So
I always encourage people to speak.
All right. I do think you should ask questions. There's no possible way I will live up to the multiple hype that was provided earlier, especially not in 2 to 4 minutes. But in looking forward, I'm not from the San Joaquin Valley. I'm mostly one of those people who flies over it to go to Sacramento meetings, which I've been doing for 10 years. But I have gotten some education over that time from both technical people, even economists in our very beginnings. One of the things, because you're talking about Sigma and you're talking about where future is, we strangely have been spending the last 10 years figuring out what the future of the San Joaquin Valley is, not on purpose. Unfortunately, what we figured out is that we think we have identified a methodology for allowing farming to continue legally in the Central Valley, which we don't believe currently exists today. I know, you'll throw stones at me later, but come to a CB Salts meeting, I'll get even. Currently, the Regional Water Quality Control Board, Porter Cologne laws do not allow them to allow you to violate water quality objectives. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. I only do that in smaller groups than this, of people who actually farm who believe they cannot meet water quality standards at the bottom of their root zone. But I can tell from some of the discussion here today, it would include some of you. So since I'm supposed to keep this to 2 to 4 minutes, if we can identify a future where farming is legal in the Central Valley, permittable, it is likely going to, just like Sigma, be focused on going back to the locals to manage this. So if you manage water, you're going to be managing water quality. If you manage water and water quality, you're going to be managing all those other acronyms Sarge Green put up there that most people hoped they would be able to retire without having to deal with. I know I did. So if you're headed down that path, what's the most important near-term opportunity you have to take a little bit of pressure off yourself? Sure, you'd like that. We all have enough. One of the things that has potentiated salinity, it doesn't say Central Valley nitrate alternatives for long-term sustainability, because when we began, the problem we began with was the long-term cancerous problem of salinity. What came to be clear was where there was salt, there was often nitrate, and where there was nitrate, there was very often users using high nitrate water. And thanks to Laurel was here this morning, isn't here this afternoon, but the folks in the environmental justice community, they made it very clear and brought that very much to the surface, and we use that as an opportunity. So these folks who are farming and aren't maybe traditional dischargers are going to be coming to your SGMA meetings, either as water pumpers or because they're going to bring to you the opportunity of being a management zone. So if you think of a SGMA entity, a groundwater sustainability agency, it may also likely be a management zone. And what that brings to you are some new people who might be able to help you afford to do the right water management and water quality management things like recharge or like providing water quality that is drinkable to folks who don't have it today. So I too, I think we all got along in the beginning, and we still will, because I am not a pessimist. I know economics is supposed to be a dismal science, but I always appreciate having the positive ones in the room. What happens is that farming will look different. It will be legal. We will continue to produce the most excellent crops in the world. That's why I live here. I came here on a summer break, and the food was great. I stayed. If anyone knows me, you know I will travel the world in search of great food. It's here. We have the ability to do this, but we're no longer going to be able to make demands on the system. This is fine motor skill management. This is not yank the lever, right? This is not the old days when the train went this way. I'm way past 3 minutes. But we can't demand that all the water rights that I should have coming to me must be delivered. I have to say, I'll trade you a little bit of water right, but I need a little higher quality water over here. I'll trade you this for that. And if we do that, we've got enough water and enough money to be able to make it work. But we're going to have to work together in a managed system, not a series of angry people demanding stuff, because that doesn't work for us anymore.
Thank you.
So I just want to say first, this has been a really excellent conversation, and I love the idea that you have academics and policy folks and the people who I admire the most, the folks on the front line, like Paul, who are figuring this out in real time. I'll confess to you that I was actually in the room when SGMA was being negotiated. I will be looking over my back when I walk to the car. And I, this is the lesson of best laid plans. Certainly, many of the things that are happening right now were completely unanticipated when a group of very brilliant people sat in a room to figure out how we could get our arms around groundwater management in California. Practically, it has been a Herculean task, and there are so many heroes that are already acting in the process on the ground that I still feel very optimistic that SGMA has great potential in California. But what I think really is my take home from today is that we have to think outside the law. I think because the timeline is so quick, especially at the front end, we have folks focused in on the mechanics of this second. And practically, for all of this to succeed, we need folks thinking about what this looks like in the longer term. how does the system, and we need to think about it as a system, not just the single molecule of groundwater in a given moment, because guess what? It was surface water once upon a time, and it's going to be surface water again. But we need to think about what the system looks like when it's functioning well, when it's doing its very best to serve all of the competing needs that we have in California. And academics, you have the luxury to do that. The folks like Paul, he's got to figure out what needs to happen in the next second. But when we talk about leadership, man, we could really use some strong leadership from the academy. I love what UC Water is doing, and PPIC too, bringing multiple disciplines together to look at this. But I think you still need to knock some heads. You still need to people have to step outside of their disciplines and really let go of all of the assumptions that you have, because when the system works optimally, it does not respect disciplines. It does not respect surface water, groundwater boundaries. It doesn't respect water quality, water supply. The water flows. And I think ultimately, looking down the road, it will be when we figure out how to reincorporate that natural system into our thinking that we'll find the solutions that won't solve all the problems. They're going to be tough decisions, but I think the key things that we need moving forward, we need to rediscover the beauty of the watershed and how it functions, and we need good examples. Orange County is a great example. No, not everywhere can be Orange County, but everywhere has a natural watershed they can work with. So how do we go from what we have today to a world where our systems, our institutional systems, are set up to maximize those opportunities? And how do we set up a system that is designed to take on the most difficult challenges and to find balance? Because right now, we save those to the end. That's why we're working groundwater now, and we didn't do it 100 years ago. So how do we bring those key challenges and key decision points to the front end of the conversation without blowing things up? Because practically, I agree with everyone else. Adjudication is the worst case scenario. So where's the balance you find? How do you navigate those questions in real time without blowing things up, but really trying to get to some agreement on how you balance competing needs within the context of a natural system? And I'll stop there.
Okay, I guess I'm next again. Paul Hendricks with the manager of the Tulare Irrigation District. Also, volunteer. We have merged the irrigation district with two cities that surround us, Tulare and Visalia, right in the middle of Tulare County, and we are now an up and running GSA, for better or for worse. So I'm serving in kind of like a volunteer fire department. We gather and keep the GSA functions rolling as best we can, and then we find the time to go off and do our own jobs. I'll kind of walk down my impressions of the panels, the three prior, and like Debbie has just said, I think it's interesting. We all are coming at this water is a very broad and diverse issue, and we come from diverse backgrounds here of all different sorts, and we all have to go home and take what's being talked about here somewhat in the abstract and move forward with our various pieces and involvements back behind our desk or out in the field, as the case may be. I think Sigma, if there's one silver lining from the perspective of someone involved in water management in a water short area, it's renewed the discussion of just that very issue, water shortages. And I will say, perhaps we weren't conscious of groundwater management certainly 100 years ago like we are today. It has been on the minds of many in some of these overdrafted basins for many decades. It's been a problem. In fact, in the 1940s and 50s, the overdraft at that time was probably about as acute as it is today. The state went about trying to tackle that problem perhaps with a different mindset, building big projects to move water from places of quote-unquote abundance, and that, of course, environmentally speaking, means things different today than it did 50 years ago, but moving that water to the areas of shortage through large infrastructure projects and cutting back on pumping and bringing extra water in the wet years to do recharge. So it's not a new problem. The Valley's been aware of the circumstance we find ourselves in for quite a long time. I think, some of that bore out in that first discussion. Helen had mentioned our the wet year type programs for land on-farm recharge. In a general way, that's been done, probably on a limited scale. We haven't found a good way to incentivize that until very recently, as was mentioned earlier by Helen, through UCD. But we were all primed for a big El Nino year. I guess all of us got a little too hopeful about the meteorologists and the press coverage, and kind of assumed it was going to happen. And it didn't. So our recharge this year was largely limited to the spring recharge in our sinking basins, as we call them, and we really weren't able to get into much of the on-farm type programs, which speaks to the ongoing theme in all three of these panels: water availability. And we certainly have in many basins, if not all of them in California, years where there is not enough water to conduct extra recharge. And there are years when there are surplus that escapes and either hits the ocean or goes to an unusable sink area of sorts. So I think in the studies that are being done, as was the focus of the first panel, various types of irrigation, land flooding, on-farm recharge, et cetera, being mindful, you had a series of all of the different factors you're looking at in that colored series of bullets. And of course, one of the many was water availability. And I think in certain basins, it's that one bullet that is the central question. How often is there surplus water with which we can use to capture that otherwise leaves the area? The second panel, I think, if any of you were here for the first panel this morning, it was talked about how farmers are feeling they're getting beaten down. I really think in this atmosphere with SGMA, I don't know whether it's because people feel sorry for the San Joaquin Valley, or I think there really is an earnest desire to help us. The Center for Sustainable Conservation and other programs, the department's outreach, for those of you that were involved in the regulations leading to GSPs, there was a tremendous amount, probably a year to 2 years of outreach by the Department of Water Resources before they came out public with a final set of regulations. And so it wasn't simply a public hearing, as was cautioned this morning, to here are the rules for you, here's a public hearing to tell you how we're going to do it. That wasn't the atmosphere at all. So I really feel like folks from various disciplines are really trying to step in and help us as best they can. We have a 50-year planning horizon in front of us, so I think all of us, including the department, have to realize things are going to change with time. This won't be really clear within the first 5 or even 10 years where we're all going. Some comments in that second panel about GSAs. I think it is going to be a given, perhaps a political reality that may be trumping the hydrogeologic reality, is we're going to have several GSAs, probably in many basins, many sub-basins in the Central Valley of California. These are being formed by governmental entities that have not been historically regulators. They have been water supply providers. They're stepping up to the plate, realizing they're going to have to take on a new mantra here and actually control the demand side aspects of the resource as well as the supply side. And so that's going to take some time. It's going to take some adjustment periods for all of us to move into that new scenario. The last institutional panel, again, I think the theme came out and some discussion was engendered about water supply. How much is there? What are the impacts going to be of the cuts? What the degree of these cuts are going to be? It's interesting. We're all scrambling with the governance and the provincial nature of who's going to be, who should be a GSA, and how many of those there are going to be within a particular basin. And yet, we don't quite know the scope of the problem. The numbers have been thrown out there: 1, 2, 3 million acre feet in the San Joaquin Valley. Some other numbers, maybe it's double that, maybe it's triple that. So we're moving very quickly in terms of governance, but yet we don't have a clear handle on the scope of the problem, which again I think points to the fact that we need some broad-scale research on a multi-basin wide basis as to what the scope of this problem, this degree of overdraft, this rate of change in groundwater storage really is that we have to solve. Because if we take these multiple GSAs, and despite their need to sign coordination agreements, But if we leave them to their own devices, we may be double and triple counting the water supplies that are available to the Central Valley. And so we need to have someone say, no, this is you have to solve this problem in the context of the overall numbers we're looking at from Stockton all the way down to south at the Grapevine. So anyway, that's my overview, and appreciate the opportunity to provide some input.
Thank you very much, Paul. Michael?
So Debbie alluded to the need for undisciplined academics. I'm at your service. So partly because we recently released a report on the topic, and partly because it is the questions that are at the forefront of so many people's minds today, I want to frame up my reactions to a lot of what was discussed in the excellent panels preceding us through the lens of governance and institutional design. Sigma can be thought of as having three phases broadly. The first is the formation of GSAs. The second is the development of groundwater sustainability plans. And the third is the implementation of those plans. And so I think it's important to toggle a little bit in time between the urgency of trying as hard as possible to get the design of the GSAs right and thinking forward about what the GSAs will need to actually accomplish. And so I agree entirely with what you were saying, that keeping the future in mind is important, but doing so with a goal to near-term decisions is crucial. So in our report, and I think we have a few copies here if anyone's interested, we essentially argue that GSAs need to develop governance that's both fair and effective, and we lay out a set of 9 criteria. I won't go through the details of that, but of these criteria, but some of them are implicit in some of the challenges that are facing GSAs. Now, we heard a lot about recharge, and in those recharge panels, there's something that's earlier this morning, and one of the things that's implicit there is an expectation that there'll be innovation, and in particular innovation towards distributed solutions. Implicit in much of that is that this type of innovation will go a long way, but to enable the types of projects that we heard about, such as recharge a la Andy Fisher and Helen Dahlke, will require strong institutional frameworks in order to enable them. For example, the incentives are quite different between groundwater banking, as it now exists, and the types of recharge projects that Helen and Andy are working so hard on, in part because of the impossibility of understanding where the water goes once it puts in the ground. So the key difference in the incentive is that the expectation is weaker for a payoff on the back end of those projects. It needs to be put in up in front. Thankfully, Sigma allows for the potential for a mechanism for that, generating that type of incentive. Specifically, it allows for putting in place fees tied to extraction of groundwater, such as happen to be in place in the Pajaro Valley in a situation that's certainly not universal. That those fees, therefore, are an opportunity, but they're also quite a challenge because it's understandable that groundwater users they could be forgiven for not wanting to pay to regulate themselves. And this is not to mention any potential challenges that arise in our California-specific situation with the constitutional provisions like Proposition 218. So there will be challenges there, but also opportunities. And what this ultimately require is GSAs with the foresight and the authority in order to the foresight and the authority and the capacity to help enable the distributed solutions in addition to more central programs. I was quite fascinated by the different stories of the scale of GSA formation. Walt remarked that there's an idealized version of the scale of GSA with one GSA, one GSP, and one groundwater basin. That might end up being the exception rather than the rule. But it's fascinating to hear the different approaches and the different drivers for assembling scale, and where in some cases you have counties that are working to bring together other existing entities, and in other cases, Thad's example of an irrigation district actually forcing a domino effect that brings together multiple counties in coordination. So the importance here is avoiding an extra layer of transaction costs, and will already be a very challenging and complex set of nuts to crack. Finally, I'll just mention a little bit about markets. I think that it's true that there's a number of questions about markets that I think make markets and not necessarily an obvious solution, although they are an enticing one, and they're a solution that I think is part of the background set of assumptions that hasn't yet been surfaced fully about the implementation of Sigma. Markets are extraordinarily good at generating efficiency. Markets are also extraordinarily good, when not designed with great care, at generating externalities and inequity. And here in California, those are both things that we care about and that we have legal levers to support. So I think it's not to be underestimated the challenge of putting into place markets that are effective and fair, and that again argues for the need for GSAs that have the strength and capacity to put those very complicated institutional frameworks in place to enable markets where they are appropriate. So I'll stop there, but there's lots more to say, and it's been a fantastic couple of panels so far.
Thank you all very much. Because we are titled here, Takeaways for Policy and Research, I thought I'd solicit from each of the panelists 1 to 3 state actions that would make Sigma implementation go more smoothly. Or, if you don't like that topic, 1 to 3 problems which academics could usefully research along the same lines. Because more research is always needed. We just need to know what it is.
All right, I'm not sure I like either of those.
Well,
I think I'm not sure I'll get 3 here, but I think one of the elements is that there's not, when you go and look at the literature of what would make an ideal, I am going to go look at the 9 things, see if those are the same 9 that are in my head. But there are a lot of lessons. I won't debate the Orange County part, except to say that Orange County is at the end of the groundwater system, and that the groundwater system and the river system work together there because everybody in the watershed works together. And while it would be fun to say that that's a great solution, it has also been 100 years of litigation and is an adjudicated basin from the top of the basin to the bottom. So you can say adjudications are bad, and they may be bad, but the results of them knowing each other and figuring out how to work together are good. So if you can bypass the adjudication and get directly to the know my neighbors, know their limitations, and know how to work with them, that would be even better. So it would be great to see some research, both economic and legal, on some methodologies that would work. And we might even come out of that with not just research topics, but something that legislators could look at to be, now there's been a lot of talk about adjudication light, but something that would actually work, and some demonstrations of places where that has worked. So I won't try for 3. That's about all I got.
Yeah, so I have way more than 3, but I'll just stick to 3. One thing that I think would potentially be really helpful is more information targeted to the individual actors that will need to take action to make Sigma work. And so, so one thing I would just be amazed if someone could actually do is to calculate the loss of efficiency in having multiple overlapping governance structures. I mean, I think really if someone could do that economic analysis, it would be shocking. And I think it potentially could be a driver, not, it will cause heartache. But for the individual person who's got to write the check at the end of the day, that might move some thinking. I also think it would be really interesting to see research on what an optimized water. You could even do a hypothetical one. Jay's working on one of these for me. Optimize a watershed. Just take a watershed in California, eliminate all of the water rights and political jurisdictions, and demonstrate how it would function optimally. Not because we think we're ever going to get there, but just as a comparison, as where we could get potentially, or we could at least get closer to that. To just give people the idea of the efficiencies that could be gained if people were willing to step outside of their political and legal jurisdictions. I'll stick with those two.
Great, thank you.
I'll mention too, one I had stressed a couple of times in my brief overview was the importance of identifying the scope of the problem as best we can, at least initially, that being the water supply availability, and I'm again speaking in the context of the San Joaquin Valley. Really, what is our overall water budget amongst these interconnected basins with fluxes in between? We have to have some good, solid numbers that we can all rally around before we can really get serious in our GSPs. My second thing is maybe a little bit of a pessimistic question posed to the department and the State Water Rights Board. This was alluded to just briefly in Sigma, and then a very brief clause in the regulations themselves. But the context is, as was discussed earlier, if you look at the way surface water got adjudicated and carved out in the Central Valley, in most places in California, it's on a very small micro scale. And I don't envision that groundwater, which initially began as a property right with someone that has a pump and a well, deep well, that it's going to map out on maybe a little bit broader scale than surface water, but not a whole lot different. So here's the question. What's going to happen in a basin? And as was discussed earlier, adjudicated basins and their history, when you look at those, they're very quite small, and they're not nearly as large as some of the basins, almost all of the basins in the San Joaquin Valley and Sacramento valleys. So are we asking a lot to assume that by next summer or 2020 or 2022, these GSPs will all come in as a nice complete package into the department on the scope and scale of some of these basins in the San Joaquin Valley with critical overdraft problems? So if that doesn't happen, and I'm speaking from a basin that's we're going to try as best we can to develop a formal coordination agreement with perhaps 2 other GSAs in our Cahuilla subbasin. But we're also candidly asking ourselves, what if that doesn't happen? And if we've spent some money putting together a credible plan that carves out our share of the legitimate share of the problem within our basin, we would probably submit that anyway to the state, realizing it will sit on the desk. I don't know if David Gutierrez is here, and he'd probably say I'm being correct here. It'll sit on somebody's desk until it moves over to the state board, who will say, well, that basin is now probationary. We're going to need, I think all of us, and maybe this is just the cart before the horse. Maybe nobody can say at this point what's going to happen in that situation where these plans come in rather piecemeal from these large basins that have a large problem to solve within a relatively short period of time. So I'd like to have that question dealt with sooner than later so we know where we're going.
I think everything's fine, Jay. but I'll mention a couple things anyway. In the spirit of the statistician with his head in the freezer and his feet in the oven, and on average was a comfortable temperature, I'll mention a big one and a little one. The big one, I think, is that, and this is not limited to Sigma, but does affect a wide range of aspects of California water, is some of the financing and funding challenges that arise from Proposition 218 and other constitutional provisions that, for our out-of-town visitors, make it very hard to put property-based fees in place, or at least set some hurdles in there that have disproportionate or have significant effects on the ability of public services to fund themselves, in particular water. I don't think that would be a snap to change, but that's sort of my big wish list. Given the discussion of recharge, I think that there was some discussion of this early in the panel, but I think the State Water Board clarifying how recharge could be considered a beneficial use. This is a term of art for those not in California. For that is comes from the Constitution and enables water use needs to be both reasonable and beneficial, and those beneficial uses are enumerated in law. I don't think this is an insurmountable hurdle as it stands, because if you sort of trace it out, ultimately what needs to happen for a water permit to be obtained is beneficial use needs to be assigned to the water ultimately when it's used. So a plan to use water for irrigation or municipal use after it's been stored in the ground is fine, but it creates one layer of administrative and accounting challenge that could be removed, again, particularly when we're talking about these distributed solutions that have regional benefits. Streamlining that's just a very targeted, small one to think about.
I was hoping that this would go quickly, this question, but apparently not. So we have a few minutes to get some ideas from the audience. Please.
So based on your discussion of 218, if an agency is placed on probationary status because they failed for various reasons, the state board supposedly can impose an extraction fee. Wouldn't that be subject to the same hurdles that the GSA has with 218 that would prevent the water board from imposing an extraction fee?
My understanding is if the fee is imposed by the state, it's not subject to 218.
Regulatory fees are not not subject to 218.
But we have a whole series of case laws saying that a fee for an extraction is a property right, and 218 specifically deals with fees on property rights.
But by local entities, not by the state itself.
That's right.
Speaking as the non-lawyer.
My lawyer is sitting in the back of the room, and we can ask her for her opinion later. I'll introduce you.
Yes, thank you. I'm from the Netherlands. I like hearing the stories here. We have the situation that we do not have fresh water at all in our aquifers anymore, in our coastal zone. We cannot bring surface water there in dry periods because the rivers tend to sail on ice. And still, that's our most productive area. And the reason for that is that they are very innovative. And to stimulate that is one of the successes. And that's one key thing I've been missing here today. Perhaps it will be done. But we have a lot of projects where we cooperate with market parties, growers, and universities or research institutes to develop, for instance, aquifer storage and recovery systems, or be more efficient. I would like to advise you to do similar things, work together, do experiments, but communicate a lot on the experiments, get people there, and spread the word. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Any additional comments? Suggestions? Graham, Professor Fogg.
Two comments. Debbie, the American Cosumnes Basin work is what you described, where we're taking all the parts of the watershed and looking at how they could be integrated differently and operate all the stores together, all the way up to the snow. And I had a question for David regarding the salt issue and compliance with the law. I've been working on groundwater contamination, I guess, more than 30 years now. And while I believe in the agricultural system, we can do things to reduce the contamination. My opinion at this point is it can probably never be eliminated. That is, contributing some level of nutrients and salts to the system. So your statement about bringing the growers into legality, as I look at the law, it's hard for me to foresee, if you interpret the law strictly, how agriculture can be conducted without having some effects.
Yeah, so I'll answer the question really quickly since we've been working on it for years and it's now 5:30. It's not to change growers. I mean, that has its own irrigated lands program, but to be able to change the basin plan, so the way Port Cologne is interpreted by the Regional Water Quality Control Board, to give them the flexibility, should the public benefit warrant it, to allow the use of water, which would increase the amount of salinity and or nitrate in the groundwater.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. This has been a remarkable conversation today. I come to these conversations on Sigma and I think, gosh, nobody could have imagined 3 years ago that we would be having these conversations. And the many more difficult conversations that we will have in the future, this is the problems we wished for 3 years ago. So welcome. I really, to me, Walter Ward's comments that this is really a generational handoff, I think is probably the best takeaway that I picked up at this meeting. This is something we have to be in for the long term, but we have to survive the short term. Ellen and Graham, do you have a closing remark you'd like to make?
Hi, I'm here. There you are. I was just going to say thank you so much to all of the speakers and moderators and all of you for being here. It's been a great conversation.
And I second that. It's been a wonderful day for me, and enjoyed it so much. Everybody.
And also thanks to Lee, who's somewhere over there. I don't know where she is. Who did a lot of the help from UC Water, a lot of the help with organizing. Hannah Noonan, who's not here from our shop, and the good folks at Water Education Foundation who kindly helped us to put this on prior to the conference, which those of you who are going to stay for, I'm sure is going to be awesome. So thank them when we see them too.
Thank you all.